World leaders meet at the United Nations as tensions in the Middle East are running high. There's consensus on the need to restore calm, but with no sign of the conflict abating, who is able to enforce a peaceful settlement, and can diplomacy really succeed? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. The United Nations General Assembly is underway in New York. After almost a year of Israel's war on Gaza, world leaders are still talking about an end to the conflict. But with the largest Israeli assault on Lebanon in decades and the death toll from Israeli bombardment of Gaza growing daily, peace appears to be as remote as ever. The US President Joe Biden is among the voices calling for a ceasefire, but other leaders have accused Washington of double standards. The US has repeatedly blocked efforts at the UN Security Council to rein in Israel. Meanwhile, Iran's leaders say Israel must be held accountable for its actions. With the growing risk of a wider regional conflict, is the UN able to fulfill its mission and avoid an all-out war? We'll go to our panel of guests in a moment, but first this report from Ferdi Akar.
I believed America had to look forward.
In his final speech to the United Nations General Assembly as US President, Joe Biden focused on Israel's war on Gaza.
Now is the time for the parties to finalize its terms, bring the hostages home, ease the suffering in Gaza, and end this war.
A plea for a ceasefire after months of failed negotiations. He also spoke about the Israeli military assault on Lebanon, the most intense hostilities there in decades. Hundreds of Lebanese civilians have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have fled their homes this week alone.
Full-scale war is not in anyone's interest. Even if the situation has escalated, a diplomatic solution is still possible.
In support of its ally Israel, the US has used its UN Security Council veto to block several resolutions demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. Other leaders accuse Biden of having double standards.
Those who are supposedly working for a ceasefire in front of the stage continue to send arms and ammunition to Israel so that it can continue its massacres in the background.
The responsibility for all consequences will be borne by those governments who have thwarted all global efforts to end this horrific catastrophe and have the audacity to call themselves champions of human rights.
Lebanon was also on the mind of the UN Secretary General, who changed his speech at the last minute.
We should all be alarmed by the escalation. Lebanon is at the brink. The people of Lebanon, the people of Israel, and the people of the world cannot afford Lebanon to become another Gaza.
Other leaders brought the focus back to Gaza.
The blatant aggression that befalls the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip today is the most barbaric, heinous, and extensive aggression, violating human values, international conventions, and norms.
There have been more than 40,000 fatal victims, mostly women and children. The right to defense has become the right to vengeance.
Away from the UN meetings, on the streets of New York, protesters called for Israel to be held to account for its attacks on Lebanon, its war on Gaza, and its campaign of occupation and violence in the West Bank. But Palestinians have waited, time and time again, for the global community to take action, and after decades of Israel's allies shielding it from accountability, few will have reason to hope that this time will be any different. Ferdi Akar, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this further now with today's guests. And we have here in Doha, Bassam Haddad, Director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies Programme at George Mason University and editor of Jadaliyya online magazine. In New York City, Habib Batta, the founder of Beirut Report, a website that features investigative journalism in Lebanon, and an adjunct instructor at St. Lawrence University. And in Washington, D.C., Brian Finucane, Senior Adviser to the US program at the International Crisis Group, he focuses on ways of reducing reliance on military tools in foreign policy. Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us here on Inside Story. I'd like to talk about the current situation in a moment. But first, maybe, Habib, let me take you back to recent years and Israel's recent conflicts. And I think I'm right in saying that there was a sort of window for military action. Israel was allowed to carry out its objectives for a time, but then, as the casualties mounted, at a point, international condemnation was so much that the UN Security Council forced a ceasefire. Why did this not happen this time?
Well, that last time it took many days of killing as well. You know, I mean, I think our lives don't seem to be very meaningful.
True. But in 2006 it was 34 days. We're coming up to a year. What is different now?
Right. You mean in Gaza, not just Lebanon? Well,
no.
I mean, I think that,
this is one continual Israeli war and bombardment, I think, even though it's on two fronts.
True. Yeah, I mean, I think people believe that this war is being sanctioned by the United States of America. Even the United States is saying that, you know, they're working to de-escalate. It makes no sense that you're de-escalating while providing weapons. So Israel has no accountability. There's nothing to rein them in. I mean, we're watching in awe as Israel just does whatever it wants, whenever it wants, any kind of weapons, any kind of civilian casualties. Clearly, you know, power does not lie in the United Nations Security Council when it comes to Israel's actions. Israel has flouted, you know, dozens and dozens of UN resolutions over the years. So in Lebanon, we have very little hope in the UN Security Council resolving this. We know that the powers are behind the scenes of the United States, Saudi Arabia, Iran. These are the big powers out there that really control Lebanon's fate and that of the rest of the region.
So, Brian, I mean, in terms of pressure on Israel, and Israel is the country, it seems, well, it's the country doing most of the bombardment, but also it's the country that hasn't accepted that Gaza deal. It seems Prime Minister Netanyahu is a holdout there. Why isn't the US being tougher with Netanyahu? Does it say something to you about President Biden?
Well, yes. I mean, he is the ultimate decision maker here. And thus far, the president has refused to use the very powerful potential leverage the U.S. possesses, military support to Israel, as pressure on Israel to try to finally get a deal that will bring about a ceasefire in Gaza, get the hostages out, and calm tensions in the region, including in the north with Hezbollah and in the Red Sea, where the U.S. is still fighting an armed conflict with the Houthis. The president simply refuses to use that leverage.
And why do you think that is? I mean, you look back at Joe Biden's history, a long career as a senator and involvement in foreign affairs, and he's spoken of his deep-rooted love for Israel. In 1988, I looked at a clip where he said, were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent one to protect her interests in the region.
Well, I think those deep-seated feelings are certainly part of the story. I think the shock that still obviously moves the president of the attacks on October 7th. He referenced these atrocities in his speech to the UN General Assembly. I think that really does drive a lot of his policy decisions, even to this day, despite almost a year's worth of carnage in Gaza and escalating tensions throughout the region. It has not brought the president to his senses and not brought him to course correct.
Bassam, I had at the beginning of the year a conversation with a senior European diplomat, and I think this person was pretty prescient because they were very pessimistic about the chances of diplomacy this year. And the reason they gave me was that the US media were going to be completely preoccupied with the election and the US administration somewhat paralysed because it's an election year. Do you think that's a significant factor in all this?
I mean, it could cut both ways. It could be something that is weaponized in order to demonstrate fierce loyalty to Israel, which we have seen people trample over each other to compete as to who is more of a close friend to Israel. And it could be a liability in the sense that making the wrong decision, not being tough enough, or potentially being a bit too tough could actually cause problems for those making those claims, given that the race is extremely close and it might come down to a small number of constituents that might sway either way. So I, however, think that it is not a structural factor. It's not a factor that is going to change things very much, given Israel's and the U.S. relationship and the U.S.'s insistence on continuing to wage this genocide along with Israel.
So, Habib, how much is this about Netanyahu? Because if you read the US media, they make this case that he reportedly has repeatedly assured the US that he was going to do things and then reneges on them, and he doesn't really care what the world thinks or the US thinks. Is that your view of the dynamic, or do you actually believe that the US rather likes the way, or some in the US administration like the way things are proceeding in terms of their strategic position in the region?
Oh, definitely. We have seen U.S. congressmen saying that they're happy with these attacks. So, I mean, the United States and Israel, for better or worse, they share the same enemies according to, their terrorist list and that kind of thing. So the United States has actually collaborated with Israel many times in Lebanon and other parts of the region. So this is, we don't really know what the U.S. role is behind the scenes. They could actually be, collaborating intelligence-wise or with the Israeli military. I think that all the claims that the United States is making and Netanyahu is making should not really be accepted. This is a media war. These are propaganda statements of this de-escalation. We know that the real, what's really happening is, tens of billions of dollars of weapons are being dropped on Lebanon and Palestine and Gaza every day. So no, I don't think that this is also about Netanyahu either. This is about the structure of Israeli state and Israel's occupation of so many people in a dehumanizing way for so many years, including Lebanon, including all Palestinian areas, all the Palestinian refugee camps. I mean, this has been going on for decades and decades. Lebanon was attacked under a different Israeli prime minister, Ehud Olmert. So this is not really about Netanyahu. This is about the kind of settler colonial Zionist expansionist state that has been operating and destroying places all around us, all around my life, all around my city and my town for my entire lifetime. And there's been no account of it. Almost, I've never seen in history two countries where they will never disagree. The United States will never criticize Israel. Billions and billions of dollars are being made too. This is also an economic story. This is big business. This is jobs for American factories making these bombs. We don't really report on that. But, there's many, many reasons why economically and politically, the United States seems to actually be supporting this war. And it's plain as day if you can just look at the numbers.
OK, let's get your take on this, Brian, because you work for the International Crisis Group, which is an international think tank, but you used to work for the State Department. You understand how it works. What's your take on this? I mean, do you think there are some in the administration, even though the administration publicly says there is the parameters of a deal with regard to Gaza and all sorts of plans they have for peace with regard to the north? Do you think there are some that actually like what is going on and think that it suits the US strategic interests?
No, I think that most of the people in the administration, even at a senior level, recognize that the continuation of the conflict in Gaza, the escalation in Lebanon, and the fighting in the broader region, again, including in the Red Sea and in Yemen, is not in the interest of the United States, that there is a strategic imperative for a ceasefire. There is a humanitarian imperative to ceasefire. And frankly, I think the White House may even recognize that, to some degree, that there is a political imperative for the ceasefire in terms of U.S. domestic politics, that this is not helpful for Vice President Harris. But they're simply not willing then to take the next step, which is to recognize that the U.S. government needs to do something to bring about that ceasefire beyond diplomacy. Because our diplomats, very skillful diplomats, including Bill Burns, the now director of the CIA, have been operating with one hand tied behind their back because they have not been able to use the leverage afforded by the vast quantities of arms, ammo, and military material that U.S. provides to Israel. They're not able to use that as leverage to bring about a deal. OK, Bassam, you've seen in recent days this expansion
to Lebanon, and I know you and Bassam have family in Lebanon, so I'm sure you're thinking a great deal of them. But it comes at the same time as world leaders happen to be meeting the 1 week every year when the majority of world leaders are all in the same place in New York City, one after one, going to that podium in the UN General Assembly Hall. And we've heard what they've been saying, and there's been a cacophony of voices of world leaders, terribly strong comments, terribly strong condemnation of Israel. It is, I think, an important snapshot of global opinion, but do you think it'll make any difference?
Unfortunately, if the majority of states at the UN were actually of any serious weight, we wouldn't have seen apartheid South Africa continue until the 90s. We wouldn't have seen the fraudulent and brutal invasion of Iraq take place in 2003. And we certainly wouldn't have seen the continuation of Israel's military occupation and illegal settlements and the gamut, which I will not repeat here, happen. So unfortunately, I do not think this will actually affect any serious change. It will affect posture, it will affect discourse. But at this point, when all of these things are happening, we see new shipments of arms going to Israel from the United States, of course, and we see an insistence on, quote unquote, finishing some sort of a job. I don't know what that is exactly. A lot of people would guess, but I could conjecture, and I will leave that to another either conversation or question. But I do not think that this is going to be consequential. And
Bassam,
really,
can I pick you up on one of the examples you used, South Africa? Wasn't it the case, though, to end apartheid, that there was eventually an international consensus? And you listen to all of those speeches in the UN General Assembly. Even President Biden is publicly saying there needs to be a ceasefire and de-escalation in the north. Don't we have that international consensus?
Unfortunately, I do not think we do, because the word international or international community has always been defined by the United States and its friends and allies. And these groups of states, whether or not they are making proclamations to the contrary, have been firmly in the camp of the state of Israel and its current genocide in Gaza. They have not actually been able to make anything of structural or concrete decision. Even we're not going to go back to the Arab states. Even the Arab states have not been able to do like literally anything. Most of them, if not the overwhelming majority of them, so much as, pull their ambassadors or actually create some sort of a unified front, even if just discursively. So I do not think we have a similar situation, and the kind of interests that are presented, perceived or real, regarding Israel's connection, Israel's alliance, are a little different than those with South Africa.
OK, Habib, many of the leaders we've heard speak at the podium say, obviously they're talking about the appalling death toll in Gaza and Lebanon, but they say this goes beyond this. They say that this is destroying international order, and they talk about the double standards of the US. President Biden on Ukraine keeps talking about the rules-based international order. How much damage do you think is being done to basic things, international humanitarian law, the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, and for that matter, the US's global reputation?
In Lebanon, people have become very cynical about these things, and Palestinians as well. There is really little belief in this international order. We know we've lived it for years, so we've seen these double standards. So the idea that there is some kind of American values or democratic values going on here, it's just a great myth that's perpetuated in the media. You have to look on the ground and see what's happening. And, we've been through these UN resolutions. We've watched these speeches. We know that the majority of the countries in the world do feel this is injustice. We know that most people do feel that this should end. However, again, no one can match, no one can face up to the United States and Israel. No one has the power to fight them. Only small militias in the region are fighting. The only people who are fighting Israel. So, it's quite a depressing thing. It's hard to believe in human rights, international law, when, again, there's been just dozens and dozens of resolutions over the years that have not been agreed to. And, Israel, it has a blank check. Israel has a blank check. That's how we feel in the world. And that's what it seems to look like. There really seems to be nothing to do but just to wait until Israel is done. And, it does seem like a lot of the language here about targeting Hamas and Hezbollah targets, this is just propaganda in many ways. There's no way to verify that any of the things that are being hit are actually Hamas or Hezbollah targets. What we do know is that, 500,000 Lebanese are squeezed into small roads, desperate for their lives. Terror is a mass scale terror that is being inflicted on the people of Lebanon. That seems to be the objective. The objective of the United States and Israel seems to be to actually, destroy Hezbollah, to destroy Hamas. And if it takes destroying Lebanon and Gaza and the West Bank, that's actually considered acceptable to many American politicians. So I think the world needs to wake up to this myth of American leadership or de-escalation or any kind of power of the United Nations Assembly, because we know where power lies. Power lies with those who have the biggest guns, the biggest bombs, and are making a lot of money. This conflict is making a lot of money for the economies in Western countries. And we don't really talk about that enough.
Brian, we have the Israeli Prime Minister. He's twice now delayed his departure to New York, but he's supposed to still be going there and possibly speaking on Friday. He knows the UN well. He was, for 4 years in the 1980s, the ambassador to the UN. Yet, since October the 7th, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has tried to place a phone call to him repeatedly, and Netanyahu hasn't taken his phone call once. What does that tell us about Netanyahu's view of the United Nations and the countries of the United Nations' world opinion?
Well, it was not subtle about his disdain for the UN General Assembly and oftentimes the UN itself and senior UN officials. Netanyahu, I think we have a better sense of whose opinion he regards as important based on his appearances for the U.S. Congress, his response to the invitation by Republicans to appear before the U.S. Congress. He understands where power lies, and ultimately it's Washington, not in Turtle Bay, not the United Nations. And so as long as he has the backing of the White House, has the backing of congressional Republicans in particular, he has a license to disregard the views of UN member states.
At the moment, we have a situation where Hezbollah say that they won't agree to any deal that doesn't involve a Gaza ceasefire. As you know, Netanyahu says that he wants a ceasefire deal. That's what he said publicly, but he keeps finding excuses, doesn't he, Bassam, not to have a ceasefire deal, because we think that if there was a ceasefire deal, his coalition would collapse. If you were in charge of US diplomacy right now, how do you untie that knot?
Well, to start with, if I were in charge of US diplomacy, I would be fired very quickly. Let's just be clear about that. But beyond that, we are talking about a policy that is not simply a decision of the moment. This is a policy that has existed for 50 some years, and it is not likely to actually change anytime soon. I am not really looking for the US to actually make a change right now, certainly not before the elections, certainly not with the current Israeli government, though other Israeli government wouldn't actually change the US position. It would just change the discourse. And I am much more interested in the breaking point that would actually lead both the US and Israel to step back. At this point, we know that Iran and Hezbollah would prefer to avoid an all-out war, but they will not hesitate to enter into one if they must. Israel, on the other hand, fears that such an all-out war would be unprecedented in how costly it will be given Hezbollah's new reach, new weapons into all areas of Israel. However, Israel is actually also trapped. It's isolated globally. It's no longer as invincible and certainly has lost a lot of that sort of image of invincibility invincibility in terms of its army. It is also severely compromised in ways that are not discussed much, and that is in terms of its actual raison d'etre of being a safe haven for Jews, which very ironically and sadly, Israel is actually the most dangerous place for Jews in the entire world right now. So this idea of banking on the U.S. to change its position is actually not going to go very far.
Okay,
US support,
let me just bring in Habib on that point. I mean, clearly something very big happens on November the 5th. Briefly, is Kamala Harris going to be any different from Biden? And what about Trump? I mean, we know Trump has been very friendly with Netanyahu, but he also is a pretty vain man. He keeps talking about wanting to win the Nobel Peace Prize. What's your view on one of these leaders and how it could change the dynamics?
I mean, from the perspective of those in the Middle East, there is no difference really between Biden and Harris's campaign. They've both pledged, to have the most lethal military, to support Israel with billions and billions of dollars. The Biden administration, as a Democratic administration, has probably given more money than Israel than recent Republican administrations. So, this is, it seems that this is an unchangeable aspect of American politics.
Okay, and on Trump,
really quite amazing.
Quickly, and on Trump?
Trump will definitely do more of the same. I mean, Trump has a rhetoric of being more Islamophobic, maybe, and more racist in his language. So that's also a bit inflammatory. It's very hard to weigh the two. There's a wish and a hope that there would be more to American politics than the same support of apartheid and a genocidal state. Unfortunately, we haven't seen the evidence of any more diversity in American politics on this issue.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us today to discuss this on Inside Story. Our guests were Bassam Haddad, Habib Battah and Brian Finucane. Al Jazeera's coverage of events across the region continues around the clock, and there's context and analysis on our website, aljazeera.com. If you have any comments or suggestions for our coverage, use our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or easy to find on X. Look for @AJ Inside Story. Until next time, please stay safe and well. From me, James Bays, and all the team here in Doha, bye-bye for now.